I'm going to start us off by discussing something that we have previously discussed on this show a couple of times.
I say real tits are better. What?
I agree with you, sir. Never a fan of the silicone. But we have talked about this before, about the potential problem the NHL could have with players on entry-level contracts.
Yes.
And I've
Caps fan like to call it, when's Kuznetsov going to get in?
Exactly, sir. I recently wrote about this again on my site, SpectresHockey.net. It's up there right now. And I touch on the whole fact of Mr. Kuznetsov and why he is staying in the KHL. And basically how the NHL blew, I thought, a golden opportunity to address what could be a potentially growing problem here, because the KHL is not going away. It's growing. Granted, it does have its problems, yes, but it is still growing, and it can offer big money to players, budding young talent, a lot more than what they could make in the NHL at the entry level, which, you know, as we all know, has not just cap on base salaries, which for this season I believe is $975K, but also has a cap on bonuses as well, which basically ensures that if a player like, say, the next Alexander Ovechkin, okay, if he comes into the league and tears it up and, you know, is among the top 10 scorers, he's the rookie of the year by default and blah, 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 the most he will see is $3.5 million for that season. And over the next 2 seasons, that's all that he will see. Even though he might then turn around and become a Hart nominee, maybe even win the Hart Trophy, maybe even win the scoring race, which, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, I believe that's what Ovechkin did during his entry-level contract, correct?
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, and guess how much he made during that time period? Here's a hint, nowhere near close his true worth. Okay? Nowhere close to his true value. Now, you know, I understand why the league's reasoning behind putting caps on these things, because that's, you know, you saw a lot of rookies under the previous CBA, you know, coming in and were, you know, they were able to pull in something like, you know, up to $5 million a pop, like Marian Gaborik did on his entry-level contract, because there were no caps on the bonuses, only on the base salary. So the league said, well, we want to control that, and a lot of the teams wanted to control that, you know. But here's the problem. You're cutting off your nose to spite your face by doing this. I mean, I understand you don't want to invest too much too soon in a promising young talent, especially if he should struggle. And then we did see that a lot. I'll give you an example just from my Montreal Canadiens. You know, we think of Andre Kostitsyn, okay? Came in with a lot of promise and everything like that. The Habs invested, you know, heavily in him coming out of his entry-level deal, granted, and he didn't play up to expectations as a result. But this is sort of this, you know, it's kind of sort of the same thing here, okay? You know, you don't want to see players coming. I think a better example would have been like Alex, you know, everybody remembers Alexander Dag, okay, back 20 years ago, who was picked ahead of...
Use his whole name, Lyle.
Yeah.
His whole name.
Yeah, Alexander
Former
Dag.
number one. No.
Number one.
Former number 1 draft pick. Yeah, Mr. No one remembers number 2. Yes, who was Chris Pronger, who went on to have a Hall of Fame career, or will be in the Hall of Fame. He has had a Hall of Fame career. Give it up to him. But anyway, yeah, you want to avoid that, but you know what? I think that's a bit of a necessary self-control as well on the part of general managers. Would you not agree? I mean, you know,
absolutely.
You've got to have a bit of restraint yourself here. Now, if you run into a situation where you've got a player agent who's going to squeeze you, well, then fine, okay? I can understand why you want to have these sort of controls in place. But what you're doing here is you're setting up a potential for the KHL to start basically draining the NHL's young talent pool. Okay? I mean, sure, it's just because Kuznetsov right now, it's not a big deal, but, you know, you got to figure this is going to grow, okay? Over time, there's going to be more Russian kids who are going to follow that example. They're going to say, well, yeah, I want to play in the NHL eventually, but, you know, I'm only 18. Hell, I can make, you know, $10 million just playing my first 2 seasons here, in my town of Vladivostok or wherever, Moscow, St. Petersburg.
With all the sanctions that the CHL seems to be coming down with in terms of what the limit on imports could be, that's gonna help aid them staying there, because it's like, well, if they don't want me, then I'm just gonna stay over here, and the drive for the Stanley Cup's not a big, the NHL is not a big deal anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, they know eventually they will come over. Okay, even if they're undrafted, they know if they play well enough, they can sign as free agents. They can avoid all this nonsense. They can spend, their first 4 or 5 seasons. You figure if you're a hot shot at 18, you could come over at age 23 and just have to do a 1-year entry-level deal. By that point, you've made, a significant nest egg. You made a lot of money.
See Brunner, common Damien.
Yes, or, again, citing example from the Montreal Canadiens, Alexei Emelin. He did the same thing. The Habs were waiting for him for years, and he's just like, no, I'm just going to stay over here a little longer. Well, I'm not quite ready yet. I'm going to stay over here. No. The real reason is because he knew he was going to make more money playing in the KHL than he was on a 3-year entry-level deal with the Canadiens. He comes over, does 1 year on an entry-level deal, and then he gets himself another year for significantly more than that. And when he becomes, eligible, he'll be eligible for unrestricted free agency next summer. But you can bet the Canadiens are going to reward him very, very well not to go that route. And if they don't, somebody else will. So he's going to do just fine that way. But the point is, this is a potential problem that once again the NHL, being typically short-sighted, and arrogant. I believe that there's a certain measure of arrogance there that, yes, the KHL's there, but it's a minor issue right now. It's a triviality. And besides, it's only Russian players. Well, who's to say the next Nicholas Backstrom or the next Henrik Lundqvist, okay, or the next Erik Karlsson, decides, you know what? I mean, geez, the KHL, I mean, they've expanded into the Czech Republic and into Italy and in all these places, and I mean, Russia's not that far away from home either. I mean, I can, I can be closer to home. I can make a lot more money, blah, blah, blah. I can take my time and then debut in the NHL. And, so it's not going to be a problem, I think, that's going to be limited to Russia. I think you're going to start to see some other, promising young European players are going to say, you know what? Sorry, but I'm just going to stay over here for a couple of years and make my money because I can make a lot more than what I can make here in an entry-level deal in the NHL. And here's the big thing, too, which I think even shows even further arrogance. Everybody assumes there is no way a North American-born player will ever go and play the KHL when they're in their prime because all their dream is to go in the NHL. Have we not learned that you can't always assume that people are going to do what you think they're going to do? I mean, think back 21 years ago in Eric Lindros, or 22 years ago. Everybody assumed that, well, yeah, his family says they're not going to go to Quebec City if they're picked, but they'll go. Remember, Mario Lemieux didn't want to go to Pittsburgh, when they picked him, but he went anyway. Yeah, and look what happened. He staged a holdout, and then eventually wound up forcing a trade. That became a big, excuse the language, a big clusterfuck between, between the Nordiques and the. There you go. But between the Nordiques had not one but 2 deals with the Rangers and the Flyers, which needed an arbitrator to settle where he was going to go. Now granted, yes, we haven't seen that situation arise since, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen again. If, a young North American star, a promising kid, a can't-miss kid, he doesn't have to be Canadian, he could certainly be from the United States, absolutely, given how well the American program just continues to improve, by the way. God, it's amazing to me why here in Canada, you wouldn't believe, guys. Look, Scotty, come on, you can back me up on this. Here in Canada, they still don't really recognize just how much the American program is improving by leaps and bounds. It's still friggin' tunnel visioned here. The CHL is gone. It's like, okay, whatever. Y'all are in for one big surprise.
But anyway. Field 2 World Junior teams.
But anyway, yeah. But to get back to my point, all it takes is one. All it takes is one. Just imagine one can't-miss kid, one guy who's a sure superstar, who gets a significant offer from, let's say, from SKA St. Petersburg. I'm on SKA St. Petersburg. But seriously, I mean, they're among the best teams in the KHL. They've got some stars. What's that?
That's the impression that I get.
Yeah, they've got some significant stars. They can afford to pay very well. Who's to say a guy could turn around and go, yes, my dream is to play in the NHL, and I will one day, but, the NHL's, I'm not going to make my true market value, playing in the NHL from ages 18 to 22 when I can make millions in the KHL.
John, did you? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a really quick question.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only because I just thought about it, and I know we've had this conversation before.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
What exactly does the entry-level contract do? Is it so that veterans don't get their feelings hurt, or is it so that teams don't invest too much money on somebody who's not really that good?
It's the latter. It's the latter. It's basically just like everything in the NHL CBA. It's there to protect general managers from themselves.
But then that begs my other question: doesn't the salary cap do that? Like, why can't you just allow a general manager to sign his best 21 players for as much money as he wants to sign them for underneath of the salary cap?
I agree with you. I do. It's a valid point, and it has been raised before. And you know what? The answer just always is, that we don't want to. It's there because we don't want to invest too much into a young star too soon. This whole thing of but veterans could get their feelings hurt, or they could, make it rough on the young player coming in. Listen, if the player is as good as Ovechkin was when he came in the league, or Crosby was when he came into the league, veterans aren't going to say jack. They're going to be glad this kid's on their team, and they're going to say whatever we're paying him, he's worth it. Okay. Yeah. Again, it's up to, the general managers, honestly, they should be the ones who should be using a bit of common sense. Now, yes, I know that player agents are going to play their part, and they're going to try and jack the price. Okay, I mean that's what happened under the not the last CBA, but the one before. That's why you saw Joe Thornton get a ridiculous contract at entry level, and Alexander Daigle before him. Excuse me. That's why you saw that, So again, I understand the rationale from that point of view. You don't want you don't want to be a general manager feeling like you're being, your prospects being held hostage on you by the agent. You know what I mean? Pay him $5 million a year or else he'll just stay home or whatever. You don't want that nonsense.
That's fine that you're doing that now.
Yeah, I know.
Honestly, what do you lose? You give the kid what you think is a contract.
Mm-hmm.
If he doesn't like it, he plays in the KHL for 2 or 3 years, but he's going to do that anyway, one way or another. So, at least at this point, it's a decently level playing field. It's like like you said earlier, it's like the NHL basically have handcuffed themselves in order to not spend too much money, and it just means they wait 4 years to get any player that wants to make a decent amount of money in Europe.
And it would have been so...
I'm sorry. The KHL is no longer a Russian league.
Yeah, exactly.
It becomes a European league when they start branching out to all these other countries. And, which
they've begun. They've already started.
The trade right away. So it's not that far.
Yeah. No, you're right, and it's like you said. And they are branching out to other countries now. They're in the Czech Republic. They're in Italy. They're in other countries now. They are, as I said, their goal is ultimately the goal is world domination. But no, it's basically to spread just from all through Europe. That's what they want to do, and eventually, because how they sell themselves is, look, we can be a competitive rival to the National Hockey League. Because I got to tell you, the NHL is being foolish by, ignoring this because, and again, it just goes to the arrogance because a lot of those leagues, the Czech Extraliga, the Swiss leagues, the Swedish Elite League, the Finnish leagues, they have not been very impressed with how the NHL over the decades have basically fleeced them by taking their best young talent and just paying them peanuts in return. Now it has improved over the last 10 years, but there's still some kind of bad feelings there. That hasn't fully gone away. And if you got the KHL, and if the KHL does this right, if they come in and it's like, yes, all inclusive, and yes, we will compensate you well, to get this prospect from you, because we are a competitive alternative to the National Hockey League, the NHL is going to have a problem on its hands, and there's nothing they can do about it for the next 10 years. If this CBA goes the full distance, there's nothing they're going to be able to do about it until 2022. They had an opportunity to address this. If they wanted to leave the cap on the base salary and maybe elevate the cap on the bonuses, I could see that. I mean, sure, pay the player, like raise the base salary for rookies to say $1.5 million. Raise the bonus out, so that way they're making at least a competitive wage, like around that could go up to say $5 to $5.5 million a season. Hey, if they don't achieve those bonuses, you're not out any money.
Yeah, that's
okay,
right.
because you do have a bonus cushion. Now you can even expand that bonus cushion if they needed to, to accommodate that under the cap. They could have done this. But it never got any talk at all. The only thing that the league wanted to do when it came to entry-level salary, they wanted to expand it from 3 years to 5.
Right.
Thankfully, they didn't do it.
That would have been, we were talking about that before, like that would have been the end of people, that would have been the beginning of the end.
Yep.
Because we would have seen people from North America go. I get this argument. For me, sort of is similar to the argument that people make about college football and basketball players needing to go to college before they go into the pros. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a lot of kids that, there's that kid that went to Kansas or Kentucky or whatever it was, the basketball player that shredded his knee last year in his freshman year that would have been a lottery pick in the NBA draft had he just come out of high school. Mm-hmm. And forcing... if there was a competitive league to the NBA, and there really isn't, but if there were, he probably would have taken that year and gone over and played somewhere else for a year instead of going to college, because I understand the importance of getting an education. Everyone does. But when it is either getting an education or making $8 million in 1 year, mm-hmm. I think you can go back to school to get your education if you need to.
Yeah.
Later on in life, if you happen to shred your knee after that $8 million.
Yeah.
The more interesting thought to that, too, is not exactly a league that rivals the NBA, but a league that rivals college.
Well, I think the big deal with all that is, first off, Nerlens Noel did go in a lottery pick. He went 6th overall, so he was still a lottery pick technically.
But he could have been much worse for him if.
It could have been.
Yeah.
But a lot of guys have. There's a couple guys who actually chose the European route for the basketball. Mm-hmm. And went over there for a year and waited till, they have to be 1 year out of high school, I think it is.
Yes.
Is the rule.
And then you have to play college.
No, they can go over to Europe, play a year there, and then boom, they're good.
To go back to hockey, what's worst case scenario of this is that at some point in the next 25 years, we're trying to figure out if all the talent in the United States and Canada is good enough to play against all the talent in Europe.
Well, I think it's a matter of whether or not the talent of the U.S. and Canada, the young kids that are coming up, are going to see the entry-level contract and be like, well, if I'm good, and if they look over in the KHL and think that they can deal with the culture change that happens there, they'll go over there rather than deal with the entry-level deal and make their money.
Yeah, which is no different. I mean, which is no different than European kids coming over here.
Exactly.
Exactly. It would just the culture thing. It'd just be in reverse. But if the money's good, and that's the thing, if the money's better over there in the early years, why wouldn't you? Ultimately, and I've heard people say to me, they said, well, who cares? No big deal, blah blah blah. It's mainly just Russian players or mainly just the Europeans. Who cares? Blah blah blah. They're not that good. And besides, if we don't see them for 4 or 5 years until they're in their mid-20s, well, who cares? Then we're getting a better player. They'll come to the NHL anyway. Blah 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 blah. Yeah, that's true. But think of the NHL without Alexander Ovechkin, or Evgeny Malkin, or Sidney Crosby, or Patrick Kane during their entry-level years. Those were 4 players who helped boost the NHL out of that post-lockout doldrums. Because remember, everybody was, after that season was lost. Remember, in 2005, the whole thing was, what's going to happen with the NHL? What's going to come out of this? And it was those young stars, those exciting young stars who started during that initial 3-year period. The NHL's rise its resurrection since 2005 came on the backs of Ovechkin, Crosby, and Malkin, and I would say, you can throw Patrick Kane in there, and Steven Stamkos as well.
Yep.
But definitely in those first 3 years, it was Ovechkin, Crosby, and Malkin. That's all everybody talked about was those three. And imagine if, now Crosby probably wouldn't have gone over, blah, 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 if there had been an alternative or anything like that. But imagine if Ovechkin and Malkin had decided, and I know Malkin's situation, how he was screwed over, but I'm just saying, hypothetical. Suppose they had decided, well, you know what, we're going to do what Kuznetsov is doing now. We want to stay over there. The NHL would be worse for it. They would be losing out on bankable young stars, exciting young talent.
Know that what if they never come? What if they play there for 4 years until that last year, the entry-level contract, and they're like, you know what, I can make just as much money here. I'll just stay.
Yeah, I'm much more comfortable playing here. The KHL is becoming a competitive league, blah, blah, blah. I get to go to the World Championships, and that's competitive, and we get to go to the Olympics.
What happens is that Americans and Canadians are like, oh, well, he didn't want to win the Stanley Cup that much. But who cares?
Yeah.
Because in 10 years, that KHL may be just as prestigious as winning the Stanley Cup.
Absolutely.
And that's just it. And that's the thing that's worrisome to some people, and not worrisome to the masses when it should be.
Yeah, and this is something, as I said,
it comes from an elitist type of view, I think, still with the NHL. And
absolutely, absolutely.
The NHL, and I love their fans, and obviously we talk about hockey all the time. But at the end of the day, there is definitely still an elitist group of NHL fans that throw their nose up at people that try to go to games, or a team that has ice girls, or a team that tries to market themselves in this way or that way, or this, that, or the other thing. And old school, it needs to. I mean, it had its place. I think
it's never going to change generation to generation. You're always going to have that one group who said, "Hey, this isn't as good as I thought it used to be." You're always going to have that one group as the times change.
When that one group is the barrier of entry for new fans, that's where the problem lies.
And by the same token, when that old school of thinking winds up being the barrier of entry for exciting young talent from overseas, okay? Because they're looking down their nose. They don't take the KHL seriously. They really don't. You can see that they don't. They look down their nose at it. Sure, now it's not an issue right now, because Kuznetsov, that's just one player, Radulov, big deal, he played and then didn't, wanted to stay long, wanted more money, he didn't get it, so he took off, big deal. Yeah, they got Jaromir Jagr, 5 years ago, but he was, he'd already played all his best years in the NHL anyway. Kovalchuk. Yeah. Kovalchuk's gone over now to Russia, but still, the NHL got him it got his best years from 18 to age 30. They got him in his best years, so no big deal. Really, on singular like that, nobody's going to miss Kovalchuk on that regard. They're really not. There's too much good young talent now, and everybody just go, oh well, okay, whatever. But if this starts to become a cumulative thing, okay. And especially, again, as I said, with the entry level players, bankable young stars who are your future, okay? Who are going to be the future of your league, who's going to keep building that support among the fan base and keep attracting new fans and everything like that. Yeah, I mean, you ignore that risk at your peril. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what takes place over the next 10 years. I honestly, because I am obviously an NHL fan and I cover the NHL for a living, I really hope that my fear is unfounded. I honestly do. Right hand to God, as Walter White would say. God, I love Breaking Bad. But anyway,
and I think a lot of the young talent you saw is these guys who integrated themselves to the North American game at a 16, 17-year-old. Gabriel Landeskog is one. Now Yakupov. Galchenyuk is technically American, but he's Russian parents and had that option as well. So,
yep.
And you see that new breed coming up, and when you start, and I think that's where it starts in the CHL. Is if they start restricting the imports that heavily, and that's when it's going to start swaying that balance of power. And if I'm the NHL, I talk to David Branch and say, hey, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater with this whole limiting import goaltenders, limiting import players, and such like that.
Absolutely, Scotty. I mean, again, it's cutting off your nose to spite your face. You know, this whole thing of, oh, these kids coming in, they're taking jobs from good Canadian boys.
Taking our jobs.
You know, that's absolutely ridiculous. The question you should be asking yourself isn't, oh, look at these foreigners coming in and taking our jobs. It should be, what's wrong with our Canadian players that they're losing jobs to more talented, Europeans. And quite frankly, I mean, it's not like you're seeing tremendously talented and skilled young Canadian players that are losing their jobs here, okay, that are losing spots. Let's be totally honest here. Who's making the cut?
You're dealing with the overage kids, you're dealing with the fringe players, you're dealing with the 16-years. That's the
Absolutely.
big deal. And I guess they're like, well, that development, well, guess what? Develop them while they're in AAA. Develop them in Junior B, Junior A. Did the development better from the grassroots level, and then you don't have to worry about these guys because they'll beat the European guys out on skill, and you can't deny that.
It just became, it's like I said, it really was this whole thing of those limits in this, on imports in the CHL. It really is much ado about nothing. It really is. It's just, we were talking about old school, okay? This is what it was. Some old school owners, some old school people, some people of influence. Hello, Don Cherry, who people of influence, who's made a lot of noise about it. And ultimately, at the end of 10 years' time, if these imports stay in place at 10 years' time, the CHL is going to be a poor league because of it. Canadian hockey is going to be poorer because of it. And ultimately, the NHL is going to be poorer because of it.
Yep, absolutely. Trickle down.
One last question, Lyle. Is it going to take a new commissioner to solve this entry-level deal problem?
No.
I don't think that you can necessarily put all the blame on Gary Bettman for this. This is endemic amongst the whole NHL Board of Governors.
I'm not necessarily saying it's his fault. Is it going to take someone new to get the ownership to change their minds about it?
Well, isn't that also collectively bargained as well?
Yeah.
Wouldn't the Players Association also have a little bit of fault to that as well?
Absolutely. It really, the NHLPA right now, they're only, when it came to the negotiating the CBA, they were just looking at right now, looking after their players and their rights right now, okay? Ultimately, it's the NHL, it's their league, okay? They determine who gets to play there, all right? And it's up to them to be forward-thinking, to be progressive-minded here, to, both consider all options and at the same time look at potential risk areas and find ways to address them. But that's something the NHL has never done. The NHL has always been reactive, never proactive. You've seen it with how they're handling the KHL. The KHL, it's like, well, the KHL's been around, 6 years now. They really haven't been that much of a threat. No big deal. Oh, they can have our cast-offs. Oh, yeah, the odd young player who hasn't come over. But that's no big deal because they all, ultimately all the best want to come over and play in the NHL. But, that's going to change. You've got a generation coming along here now, all right, over the next 10 years of this CBA. There are 10-year-old kids in Russia right now who all they know is the KHL. Yeah, they know of Ovechkin and Malkin and yes, and they cheer for them and everything like that in the NHL. But they're seeing stars in the KHL now, okay? They're seeing, top-level hockey at that level. And they're going to have something to aspire toward there, and it's going to be, well, hey, here's the KHL, it's very competitive. And if you start to slowly attract over, young, some name players, I said, like Kovalchuk, obviously, the occasional one like that. But there's going to be a generation of young talent there that's going to look at the KHL and think, you know what, this is the league for me. Not because they're not good enough, but because this is their home, and it's a competitive league. And it's an international league because you're playing in different countries in Europe and everything like that. So, it's like I said, I think the NHL ignores this problem at their risk, and ultimately I think at the end of this CBA, they're going to have to look at changing how their rules governing entry-level contracts in order to make it more attractive for European talent to come over and play in their league.
They'll only change once it happens.
Oh, absolutely. It won't happen before. You're right on that point, Johnny. It will definitely be once the problem has manifested itself and has gone on and got malignant. Then they'll turn around, oh, gee, I guess we better do something about this. Just like how, remember, before the last lockout, fans were bitching for years about all the uncalled, remember the dead puck era, they called it, all that uncalled obstruction and hooking and holding, how it was sucking the life out of the game, how scoring was down, and blah, 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 and everybody said the game was exciting, and the league's ratings were down, and they were struggling at the gate. What did it take for them to finally implement changes to the rules? Was a season-killing lockout, and that was just really done just like, okay, we got to get we could be losing fans here. We got to do something to get our fans back. Rule changes. Let's do these rule changes to speed things up. Yeah, the fans were only asking for that for 10 years beforehand. When you had whistleheads like Mike Milbury sitting there saying, following the 2002 Winter Olympics, saying, we like our game the way it is. Unfortunately, there's a lot of whistleheads still running the show in the NHL at the Board of Governor level. And that's the way it is, kids.
It's always going to be that way. You're always going to have the old guy. You're not going to have, in this line of business, I don't think you're going to have a guy who's going to be that radical in terms of how things change. I think you're just going to get a turnover of one, maybe a younger group, but I think it's still going to be the same old bucketheads the entire time.
It always has been. You can go back and look back 20 years, like 20 years ago, when at the time you had guys that were progressive owners at the time, of which Bruce McNall, yes, I know he turned out to be a criminal, but he was among a group of progressive owners.
One strike against him.
Ed Snyder of the Flyers was another who was considered a progressive owner back then. Yeah, Ed Snyder, 20 years ago, believe it or not, was considered a progressive owner back then. But since then, look what's happened. It just, the faces change, if you're in there a long time like Snyder is, eventually you wind up not being so progressive. And then meanwhile, the ones that the new ones that come in, they manage to be a little bit progressive, but ultimately don't really have that much influence. I give Gary Bettman credit in one factor in that, in terms of addressing issues, he's proactive that way. Okay, when problems come up that it's beginning to affect the NHL's bottom line, he is able to make, the Board of Governors listen to reason. But it's like, for God's sake, yeah, that's great, but, rather than being a friggin' crisis manager, why don't you try and be a little bit more proactive so you can avoid these problems when they come down the road? Just saying.
It's the old adage, cross that bridge when you get to it.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
It's
always going to be that way until their bottom line is affected.
And
everyone knows once that bottom line starts to get affected, that's when they care about it. So be it. That's always been sunrise, sunset.
Yeah, and that's what it's. And you're right, and that's what it's going to be when it comes to these entry-level players. And you're right, Scotty. What it's going to take is their bottom line being affected. When the next Ovechkin and Malkin and maybe even the next Crosby says, you know what, I can earn more money. From now until I'm 22 or 23 playing over in the KHL. Yeah, I'll be over NHL eventually, but you know what? See you guys later. And what that ultimately does is it gives legitimacy to that rival league that the NHL was trying to avoid. So they're their own worst enemies.
Indeed. And I think the NHL, or a lot of the Board of Governors, is also betting that this expansion of the KHL a little bit too fast, a little too ambitious. Even though it is a smart ideal.
The problem is
sorry, go ahead.
The problem is they have a shit ton of money.
Yeah,
so
a lot of oil money.
And the NHL,
and they can print up their own money as well.
Is having to sell franchises and have franchises be owned by the NHL because they can't find people to buy them. And in the KHL, they have so much money, they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, you've got Russian oil barons. Sure, the league's floated by Russian oil barons, but let's face it, they got a lot of money. They're ambitious, and
they got the government in their pocket too.
Yeah, and worst of all, they're hockey fans. Yeah. They really are hockey fans, and they look at the NHL and you go, you know what? We've gotten the back of the hand from the NHL for too long. And that's where all this came from. This has all been simmering resentment that just finally came to a boil 6-7 years ago, and I think the NHL is going to rue the day. I'm not saying that the KHL will take over and become the dominant league. I don't foresee that happening. But a viable, competitive alternative for a long time, absolutely.
What the WHA should have been.
Exactly. Yeah, what the WHA should have been.